Good morning. Thank you for tuning in to today's genealogy program. Today is October 11th, 2025. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we're coming to you from City Hall in Canyon City. Today's topic is Utopian Communities, presented by Terri Meeks, as usual. So, before we hop into that, I just want to remind everybody, I'm going to encourage you to drop any questions or comments you may have into the chat feature on your Zoom there. We'll be happy to address those at the end of the program. And thank you for tuning in. I have a few announcements. I'll wait till the end. And at this time, I'll just hand it over to Terri.
Good morning. We're going to talk about the utopian communities this morning. And in doing the research to support this program, I was surprised at the number of communities that did exist and the far-reaching membership that they enlisted. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. So what exactly are utopian communities? They are intentional settlements, unlike immigration or migration, where people set up actual communities or villages. These are settlements that cropped up, and they were usually only the members of the society that were living in that settlement. So there's a little bit of a difference and distinction there. They wanted to create an ideal or perfect world, and they were based on a set of shared values, beliefs, or social structure. So the people that came to these communities were like-minded folks. In the community, it was communal, meaning that everyone's needs would be met, everything would be shared, supposedly equally. And many of these communities arose because they wanted to overcome the ills that were existing in their community and their society. Most of these communities arose during the Industrial Revolution, and we'll see why they were so popular. An actual definition from a historian says that utopian communities consist of a group of people who are attempting to establish a new world pattern based upon a vision of the ideal society and who have withdrawn themselves from the community at large to embody that vision in experimental form. So it's interesting to see that, like the communes in the 1960s, people were dropping out to join a community. They started pretty much very early. In 1732. The Ephrata community in Pennsylvania was organized by German immigrants. And the roots for these communities came about as a result of the Protestant Reformation. They wanted to avoid persecution, and so groups immigrated to America. The Ephrata community was established in 1732, but unfortunately it was destroyed. Members of the community took care of injured soldiers during the Revolutionary War. And unfortunately, typhoid broke out. So it killed both the soldiers and the residents. So the community failed. In 1787, the Shakers established themselves in New Lebanon, New York, and they are still in existence today. In the 1820s, Scottish and Welsh labor radicals established communities in the United States. They had established large businesses, large industrial concerns in England, Scotland, and Wales. And they wanted to bring their ideas and ideals to the United States. Since our country was young, they were open to any of these experiments. Um, they were not afraid of communal labor. Um, Gender equality plays a lot of importance in some of these societies, and racial justice as well. And this is a time when women are advocating. It's a little early for the women advocating for the vote, but in terms of racial justice, the abolition movement was just getting started, as well as the temperance movement. Most of these communities did fail, but they did have an everlasting effect in that they did arouse debate. The debate continued for many, many years as to whether this type of society was beneficial to the greater good. And we do see some of the reforms that were adopted from these communities. Here is the Ephrata cloister where people lived. It still exists. I think it's a beautiful building. And this is an entrance to the Ephrata, and you can see the construction. You can see, number one, that people were much shorter than they are today, and you see that large wooden beam sitting on that cement or stonework, and that might actually be a fireplace or an oven. So there were both religious and secular utopias. And we see a huge surge in the 1840s. Before the Civil War, there were approximately 130 communities that had been established. During the Civil War, the buildup decreased because the men especially, were off at war. But as soon as the Civil War was over, we see a revival. The numbers grew once again. Eventually, in the early 1900s, the number of communities declined. There were internal conflicts, and we'll see some of the reasons for these conflicts. There were economic problems. How did these communities make their money? And there were external pressures in a lot of cities, towns, villages. These communities were not popular because some of their views were extreme. Here is just a partial list, and you can see from the early 1820s how many of these communities are in existence. And they do cover a lot of the East and the beginnings of the Midwest. With the Industrial Revolution, people were moving from their homes in remote areas, farmlands, into cities and larger communities. And because the people were working long hours for little pay, there was some extreme poverty. There was a lack of education for the most part. And so this reform movement was based on alleviating the causes of poverty. As I just said, the temperance movement was just beginning. Religious and social reform movements were also taking place. And by and large, all of these uh, activities were to get a better life, relieve some of that poverty, provide some of that education, and provide equality. They wanted to escape the problems that the Industrial Revolution was creating. And we have to realize that in the Industrial Revolution, there were some people that made a very large profit on the backs of their workers that were working many hours for low wages. So they wanted to create a more equitable situation for their society. On the other hand, the availability of land was really wonderful here in the United States. There were little or no government regulations at the time. So people were moving from overseas to the north, and people were moving from the north out to the Midwest. And it's the early Midwest, the Ohio, Indiana, and we'll see eventually past the Mississippi River. They gained inspiration from European intellectuals and reformers. It's interesting to see how they looked to members of society that were the intellectuals, the writers, the people in government, to get ideas and to incorporate them into their system. Some of them also, the religious ones especially, were trying to establish religious ideals and Republican ideals. And we see this huge number, more than 100,000 individuals formed utopian communities. This is not just the communities themselves, but those that are forming them. So let's dive in and take a look at just a few of these actually, of societies, how they got started, the products that they produced in order to earn money, and what their philosophies were behind them. The Shakers, their formal name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Coming, or appearing. And they began in England in 1747. And they actually split from the Quaker Church. Jane and James Wardley formed the society, and Mother Ann, who was a member of that society, took a group of followers and moved to America in 1774, settling in New Lebanon, New York. And here we see a map of their community in Lebanon, New York. We have the main route going through, and we see a number of little small groupings of houses where people lived, where people set up education, the church, and any shops for producing goods. Here is a Shaker church at Mount Lebanon. And they did have communal living. All of the property was shared. The Shakers and had absolute celibacy as one of their tenets. In order to grow the community, they would adopt children, often orphans, or they would recruit converts from outside of their interior community. It was interesting to read that when recruiting converts, whole families had to join. If a husband was interested in joining, he had to bring his wife and children along. By the same token, if the wife wanted to join, the whole family had to join the community. And this caused some problems. So we'll see that in a moment. Until January of this year, there were 2 Shakers left. But in the spring, a woman joined, April Baxter. And so now there are 3 Shakers. They were pacifists. They did practice gender equality. Their women did the same work that men did and received the same benefits that the men did. The name Shaker derives from the spontaneous dancing that might erupt during their worship services. Very similar, a derivative from the Quaker religion. Here is Brother Arnold Had, who is, I think he's in his 60s. Sister June Carpenter is in her 80s, and the newest lady, April Baxter, who joined, is probably in her 50s. So the Shakers expanded, and you can see how they used their recruitment. They eventually had 19 settlements in the Northeast Ohio and in Kentucky. And by the Civil War, they had 6,000 members in their communities. In terms of their livelihood, they made items especially for outside commercial distribution. And to the small extent, they still do today. Here is a brief list of some of the Shaker communities. The one at the bottom, the Sabbath Day Lake Shaker community, is the one that is still active with the 3 members. Others of the communities are no longer active as Shaker villages, but are operated for tourist interest. So they do, some of the villages still do exist. Seeds. They sold seeds. That was one of their money-making projects. But they are most famous for their simple woodwork. Everything in this room pictured was made by Shakers. The furniture, the weaving of the rugs, the weaving of the basket that sits on the table, etc. And we see some others of their woodwork as well as weaving. Here's a map. This is the Union Village, and we see how the houses are laid out in sections. We have the north lot, the south house, and there's their communal living. They had separate doorways. The men entered through one doorway and lived in a barracks-like environment on probably the first floor. The women had a completely separate entrance on the other side of the building and probably lived exclusively on the second floor. Here's a page of the census. This is the 1850 New Lebanon, New York census. And we see both in the extreme left, both Shakers and Quakers, But for the most part, these are exclusively Shakers. We see the multiple different occupations that these people were involved in. And for the most part, we do not see family groups. We do see individuals. And I noticed at the top are the oldest people, and at the bottom seem to be the youngest people. So these are probably the single men that are involved in the community. Here is also an 1850 Enfield, New Hampshire Shaker village. So if one of your people happened to fall in this census area, you know automatically that they were probably Shakers. We see also in the craftsman cards at Ancestry, we see the Canterbury community, also in New Hampshire, and their whole occupation is the making of furniture. And we see the years 1825 to 1875. Another map of a Shaker village with a listing on the right of what each of the buildings' purpose was. In Lexington, Ohio, another Shaker community, and in 1850, and they were making a furniture. This is an 1870 newspaper, and the article concerns the divorce and the attempt to reclaim her children for Mary Dyer. This is a secondary famous case. Earlier in 1814, Eunice Chapman in New York finally succeeded. Her husband had joined the Shaker community. She had no interest in it, and she wanted her custody of her children. She is the only woman to ever obtain a legislative divorce through the New York State legislature. But Mary Dyer was active at the same time. This is 1817. And for many years, she tried, and I don't know whether it was successful or not, but to obtain her children rescue them from the Shaker community. Here is another 1899 Camden, Tennessee Chronicle article about the passing of two Shaker sisters and the what is happening in the community. The Harmony Society. This was another one led by George Rapp. He was a German who organized a harmony society in Germany, and eventually he had 12,000 members in Germany. They were religious separatists, and they were not popular in Germany. So he was actually imprisoned for his religious beliefs. And he eventually, in 1804, he, along with 800 other members of the community, moved or settled in Pennsylvania. They were able to establish their community, and at some point they needed more land. So they purchased 20,000 acres along the Wabash River in Indiana. It's an interesting story because they sent people out to look for land They sent 4 men out and they saw some property, but they couldn't agree on it. So 2 others were sent forward to acquire the land. They were a separatist group, but they did pursue Christian perfection. He was quite successful in Harmony, but eventually he did in 1825 sell his property to Robert Owen, and he returned with some of the members of his group to Pennsylvania. Here is his book about him, a drawing, a painting of his actual selling of the land to Robert Owen. And who was Robert Owen? He was a Welsh textile manufacturer, and he made his money in the early 1800s from a textile mill in New Lanark, Scotland. And at the time in New Lanark, Scotland, this type of movement, a reform movement, was underway. He moved to the United States in 1824 with his son William, and he wanted to establish an experimental socialistic community. So he founded a utopian socialism. He actually is the founder of utopian socialism, and he also developed the cooperative movement, and we'll see some of the results of that. He owned factories in Scotland. He knew what working conditions were, and to his favor, he did work to improve the working conditions for his own people in Scotland. He promoted experimental socialistic communities, even in Scotland, and he developed the more collective approach to child rearing, rather than children growing up in with their single parent family. They did a communal, collective approach to child rearing. So the children experienced different adult governance. He believed in lifelong education and did establish an institute for the formation of character and a school for children. And he did advocate for additional education throughout his life, as well as that for others. While Rep's community was Harmony, when they moved to Indiana, their community became New Harmony. Owen purchased the existing town, which consisted of 180 buildings and several thousand acres. He, too, sought support from thinkers, reformers, intellectuals, and statesmen. And in 1825, for 2 times, he addressed the House of Representatives and other government officials, outlining the vision for his utopian community here in New Harmony. And in his audience was John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, all of these presidents that we know today. So he did have extreme support from these people. New Harmony became the center for educational reform, scientific research, as well as artistic expression. The people that were part of the community came from all aspects of life, and he encouraged them to spread their wings and do more. He attracted over 1,000 residents. Unfortunately, it was an economic failure. The community only lasted for 2 years. And when it dissolved, many of the people that were there, the skilled people, actually stayed and lived out their lives there. Here is a placard at the city that talks about the Harmonists and the Owenites that actually settled there. Here is the view for Owen's new moral world. He felt that having the right environment influenced individual people's behavior. He did not base his ideas on any religious tenets, whereas Rep had established his based on religion. They were harmonists. This is independent of religion. The group believed in communal living and progressive systems of education, and they had the inequality of the sexes. Here is a listing of a partial listing of some of the people in 1830 that actually lived in New Harmony. And we note that they have the total number of slaves. It's chopped off, so I'm not sure. There's no listing for number of slaves, so it's probably the total number of people excluding slaves in the right-hand column. Here is a member of one of the communities from Find a Grave. Here is a book about the education and reform and how it developed. And here is Owen's own book about New Harmony, as well as what is there today. Mormons. They are also described as a utopian society. And it's because they wanted to create self-sufficient, community-oriented communities. And their case was based on religious beliefs. They practiced economic collective action. They pooled their resources. They pooled their labor. And the results of that labor, the goods that they produced, the services that they produced, were then distributed equitably, evenly across the board. What you input and succeeded in growing, you were able to then claim your increase. They sought to establish a new social order. They prioritized the group over the individual. And like other communities, they emphasized social harmony. Similar to the religious communities, they advocated adherence to religious doctrines. They tried to establish what they call Zion, a utopian society of the righteous, and they were founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith. They established communities in Nauvoo, Illinois, and in Utah Territory, and they had a commitment to building a separate social order. And that goes back to the definition of utopian communities. People were who withdrew themselves from the community at large to embody a vision in an experimental form. So they practiced united order. Members consecrated their property to the church, and then stewards distributed the rights to that land, possessions, etc. They balanced that individual ownership and the communal needs. So we're trying to get everything even and level. They practiced perfection ideals through adherence to faith and principles. And we see here a book about heaven on earth, planned Mormon society. Brook Farm, the actual full name is the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education. They were founded in 1841 by George Ripley and his wife, and they had 15 members. They had purchased 200 acres, and this was a case where you had to buy into the society. Membership depended on property ownership, and they established a stock company, a joint stock company, and you bought in at $500 a share into the community. The stock that you received entitled you to vote on community policies. And here we see a newspaper article that talks about those community buying into the community and what you actually owned as a result of it. Their life in that community was based on plain living principles such as individual freedom, humane relationships, and harmony of mind and body, which is wonderful. Here, physical labor meant mental well-being and health. So the more you worked, the better your physical being was going to be. Farming was the most favorable occupation to personal growth. And they wanted to end the division between those that had education versus those that were simply the laboring classes without education. They never actually had more than 120 members at any one time. They did attract intellectuals and artisans. They provided housing, fuel, wages, clothing, and food for all of their members. And it was interesting that you could work at any job, but you were paid according to the value of the job. What kind of contribution was it making to the stock portfolio? They had infant and primary schools and actually established a college preparatory course. And here again, one of these societies, they had a farm, they had a fire as well as their financial issues. So it only lasted 5 years when that fire destroyed things, they were forced to close down. I did find a description that in the mornings, everyone in the community would wake at approximately 6 o'clock. They would eat breakfast, then work for 10 hours during the summer or 8 hours in the winter. but enjoyment was part of or one of their main focuses. The most important custom at the farm was the symbol of universal unity. And this ritual was performed by the entire company rising and joining hands in a circle and then vowing truth to the cause of God and humanity. So, they did, prior to the fire, they did reorganize under the principles of a French socialist, and they developed a plan for their communities. They wanted to spread, so they developed what they called phalanxes. And at one time, there was actually a well-developed community of these phalanxes. There were more than 40 of them actually in the northern part of the United States in the 1840s. They fought for abolition, they fought for women's rights and labor rights. And here is what it was called, the Hive. This was their main residential building, as well as a library, dining hall, etc. The dining hall could accommodate 50 people. So there was a library, it was a social gathering place, and the center of their intellectual life. And here we see a book about George Ripley, the founder, Brook Farm. And just looking into it, among the members at the top of the right-hand page, we see the writer Nathaniel Hawthorne as a member. And then among visitors, we see Ralph Waldo Emerson. So they did reach out to these intellectuals. The Oneida community, they sought to create heaven on earth. The community was established in 1848 by John Noyes in central New York, what is today Oneida, New York. And they had two branches, one in Brooklyn and one in Wallingford, Connecticut. And unlike the Shakers, who were waiting for the second coming, they believed that it had already occurred. Here is a picture of the Oneida community from 1850s. This is in Oneida, New York. This is one of their other communities in Connecticut. Looks like mostly men, but there are a few women. They required members to relinquish their private property. Here again, communal living. Unlike some of the others that advocated celibacy, they embraced what they called complex marriage. In other words, free love. Even if you were married, you could have sexual relations with anyone that consented in the community. They too believed in communal child rearing. Divorce and remarriage was permitted, which at this time is probably pretty revolutionary. They also practiced what they called mutual criticism, as long as you didn't criticize Mr. Noyes, the founder. This community, especially because of the free love, did incite a lot of public outrage. The larger community was not happy with these people. The community did recruit several hundred residents. The practice of, go back, the practice of complex marriage was abandoned within the first 2 years of their existence. The mutual criticism did continue throughout. Here is a picture of the Oneida Community Mansion. The mutual community encouragement of children and their education. One of the newspaper articles about the outrage among the community, the Episcopal and Presbyterian bishops and priests in war paint. You know, we don't want any of this free love in our community. However, the community did thrive for more than 3 decades, more than 30 years. When Noyes tried to step back from leadership, the community actually collapsed. So he must have been a very strong leader. It was, with that communal living and criticism, it was a revolutionary for its time. They did pave the way for advances in women's rights as well as workers' rights. And everyone worked 4 to 6 hours a day. No one accumulated any material possessions. Everything was equally divided. And to raise money to support their group, they canned fruits and vegetables. They manufactured animal traps, chain link, and silk sewing thread. And in 1877, their Wallingford, Connecticut community started making spoons. And by the 1890s, the Oneida Community Limited was focused on the cutlery market. So here we see some labels for their canned products. So if you own any Oneida stainless steel, this is how it got its start. We see John Noyes in the 1850 census, and we see that he is making, it's the 1860 making, he's a trap manufacturer. Here are some of the traps. And also in the 1870 census, we see a gentleman named Erastus Hamilton, and he is actually an architect. And this is one of the drawings that he did for the original communal mansion. I believe he also designed the one that we saw in 1878. The Amana colonies. Here again, it's a German group. This group were pietists, and they believed in transformation through spiritual rebirth and renewal, individual devotion and piety. God also, they believed, still spoke through prophets, similar to Mormons. In Germany, they refused to serve as soldiers, and they wouldn't send their children to the Lutheran schools. So they too were forced to retreat to abbeys in Germany, where they were able to establish their philosophy of communal life and grow. So they were persecuted by the government, the German government, as well as the Lutheran Church, and they immigrated to the United States. They settled in 1842 in West Seneca, New York. They actually 800 members came, and they purchased 5,000 acres and named their community Ebenezer. They were they labeled themselves as true inspiration congregations and inspirationalists. Here is a map of their Ebenezer community. Looks very much like any town map. And here is an article that I found on Ancestry about one of their members, John Prestel. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. He was born in Germany, came to the United States, and he immigrated to Ebenezer in 1843. And for 2 years, he tended the orchard there. He had a natural talent for drawing. And in 1845, the community gave him permission to pursue his interest in botanical art, and key and critical, to buy a printing press. Here is one of the drawings, the botanical drawings of cherries that Prestel made. Because of their religious beliefs, Prestel never signed any of his drawings. And it wasn't until into our current era that he was even recognized as an artist. Here he is listed as an artist in the 1855 Seneca, New York census. Actually, I think this must be, it might be Iowa. In 1850, let me go back. Here is his home, still in New York, from 1848 or so. But by 1860, in 1854, the whole Amana community, they had purchased 5,000 acres, but they needed more land. So they eventually went to Iowa. And here's the 1860 census where Mr. Prestel is listed as an artist. They named their new community a name that I cannot pronounce, but it means remain faithful. And by 1856, they actually did move to Amana, Iowa, and established 7 villages on 26,000 acres. They purchased the nearby town of Homestead because they needed an outlet for their products. So they needed access to the railroad. And here is a map of the Amana villages as they exist today. And we see West Amana, High Amana, Middle Amana, East Amana, just plain Amana. And we see Homestead down in the lower right-hand corner where they have railroad access, even today. All lands and buildings were held in common. A little bit different philosophy here. Prosperous settlers were expected to pay community expenses. So if you had more equity, you were expected to pay more. Originally, marriage was considered a spiritual weakness. And it was permitted only with the consent of God. A couple of these communities believed that your union on earth with someone else detracted with your spiritual connection with God. So here again, we're going to celibacy. Childbearing was discouraged, and they were among the first to develop and advocate birth control for their members. They did have communal kitchens and communal dining. Men had many more jobs than women did, but all worked for the benefit of the community. Their church was run by a board of trustees, and the church actually met 11 times per week. No musical instruments or singing. And they came to the attention of the Iowa legislature, and Iowa law required them to incorporate as a business. So they became the Amana Society in 1859. They drew up a constitution, established a government, and here again, we've got a long, long process. They lived a communal life until 1932. And one of the reasons for dissolution was that members sought more personal freedom. And I think that probably goes for most of the other societies that we have seen today. Because most of them were German immigrants, they did adhere to specialized crafts and farm occupations. They brought these talents from Europe and passed them down from generation to generation. They used what they had on hand to provide power, and they made furniture, clothes, and other goods. Their weaving and their production of wool and calico were exceptional. We see a woman here actually at a loom weaving. We see farm women and young girls separating fruit. We see women and young children working in the farm fields. Men working, looks to me like firewood. And we see the Amana census. This is an 1880 census. So we know that all these people are members of the Amana community. And we see that they are pretty prosperous. They own portions of land in the 40 acres up to, I see someone that owns 300 acres, but they worked hard and they prospered. This is a 1915 Iowa State Census card, and we see that Gottlieb Anderson is a calico printer. Their fabrics are very well known. We see Iowans that are subject to military duty. Arden, Delaware. This was founded in New York by a sculptor, George Stevens, and an architect, William Price. And we see that they expanded to 2 other Arden villages. They had homes around 250 and 500 residents. And essentially, they were an artist colony. Here are the map of the community. And we see how Henry George was a 19th century reformer. He was concerned about economic inequality due to land ownership. He believed that people should own the full value of what they produce, so that the government should be supported by the value of the land, but the people should be able to keep the monies that they earn from everything that they produce. And this was called Georgism. It was part of a single tax movement in 1895 and 6 that was widespread in the case of across Delaware. The government should be financed by land values. And so Arden was born under this case. Land was owned in a trust. It was rented with 99-year leases. And the rent price was set by a board of assessors. And here we see that a large single tax conference that promoted these ideas. They were very involved in the arts and crafts movement, which both had a reaction against industrialization of design, and they valued the workmanship and quality of the items as far as their appearance was concerned. They were part of the Garden City movement, where they would bring together the best parts of the city and rural living, separate communities separated by green belts. So that's why that map showed the 3 communities, but without major divisions. And we see here a 1910 census where George Hopkins is a sculptor, and a 1940 census where Earl Brooks is a photographer. We see a suffrage parade in Arden. Their welcome sign to the community. Oops. A craft shop. And some of the artists, sculptors. And here's a thesis that someone wrote about Arden, the architecture and planning of a utopia. Here are current, or a listing of the 19th century. This is only a partial list of these communities. And here are the 20th century. The Arden Village is still active. So I hope you have a better understanding of these communities, how they came about, how they prospered, and then unfortunately passed. So I will turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. I have a much better understanding. I learned a lot today. I was just thinking about what you said, how they prospered. They were so organized in so many ways and well connected in a lot of ways, and then kind of fell apart in a lot of ways too. So thank you very much. Just real quick, this coming Saturday, October 18th, the museum will be closing early, so we'll be closing at 3 p.m. So if you have any business to take care of with us, just make sure and come down a little earlier in the day. And then our next community coffee will be on October 23rd. And that's going to be Hometown Mysteries. So if you know of any mysteries or you remember hearing any stories of unsolved or unexplained things that may have happened in the area, come on down for some free coffee and donuts and we will enjoy the discussion. And then, of course, next month, our virtual genealogy program is the Dawes Laws, November 8th at 9 a.m. A virtual program as always.